Alright, welcome back YouTube, and thank you for joining me once again in Manning School of Art. Today will be the first day for our watercolor series. We're going to be doing a series of videos that is going to teach you how to work with watercolors. This series is meant for beginning watercolor artists, or if maybe you've done watercolors before but haven't done it in a long time and you need a refresher, this series will actually work very well for you as well. We're going to break it down into sections. So like today's video is going to focus mostly on the materials and supplies that you're going to need to follow along in the series. In the second video, we'll be looking at how to create a color wheel using watercolors, and also some very basic watercolor techniques including wet on wet, wet on dry, masking, and so forth and so on. So our goal today is to go through this list of supplies and materials that you're going to need to follow along in this series. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about why I chose the ones that I did, and to kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown to hopefully get you prepared and to save you a little bit of money as well. So this page, this materials list, is actually located now on our new web page. I will add the link to the comments below so that you can actually look to see what you have and or what you need so that you can follow along with us. Okay, I'm going to switch camera angles and then we'll get started. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started with the materials list. I'm going to go right down. Everything that is highlighted here is the stuff that I would recommend. You'll notice, if you've been following me with the inking technique, that you can use a lot of the same materials when you ink as when you do watercolors. So let's go ahead and go through this list. The first thing that you want to get is a decent mixing palette. I've tried a number of them, but this one seems to work really well. It's got plenty of pockets right here to mix your colors. And what I really like, it's got this little detachable thing right here. So like if I'm mixing a lot of colors here and I need to clean it, I can just take this off, clean it, put it back on. And I like the fact that it has a white paint underneath it, because your colors show up better than, let's say, if you had like a gray palette or something like that underneath. The next thing on our list is watercolor paper. What kind of paper do you want to get? Well, watercolor paper comes in all kinds of different sizes and different weights. The most common weights are 70 pounds, 140 pounds, and 300 pounds. And it could be hot press or cold press. The hot press tends to be much smoother than the cold press, but the cold press, in my opinion, seems stronger. This is a painting that I did on the hot press, and it worked really fine. It holds up well with the water and everything, but when I removed the tape from the backing, the top layer of paper actually failed, which is not a big issue because it's going to get matted anyways, but it's not quite as strong as this right here. The cold press, it's a little bit stronger, but it's much more textured. So you have to decide whether or not you like the texture. I personally do. I actually use the texture to my advantage when I'm painting. The next thing on the list are watercolor brushes. Now, this is my full set of watercolor brushes, but you do not need to have this many brushes to get started. So the ones that are on the list, the ones that I'm going to recommend are, you want to get a 0 watercolor brush or a 00 watercolor brush round so that you can get into finer details. Number 2, I would say this is one of my go-to brushes. You can get some bigger stuff, but you can also get some really fine lines. And this is a sable brush, but you can also get a synthetic 1/2 inch flat. So my 1/2 inch flat is right here. So 1/2 inch flat. This is great for getting into intermittent areas and to wet the surfaces, and this is also a sable brush. The 1 inch flat I also use to get into really large areas. Now this one, as you're going to see when we talk a little bit more about the brushes, this does not have much of a bounce back, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's nice and wide, it's very soft. All of these brushes are very, very soft because we don't want to damage the paper. A hake brush is basically a wide brush like this Most of the time they're made out of goat hair. They're extremely soft. Now I don't actually paint with these, but what I use them for is when I need to wet like the entire surface, when I'm getting ready to stretch paper, and you can also use these when you're applying your varnish at the end, and we'll get more into that in a different section, different video. Alright, so how did I come to my decision on the type of brushes that I need? Well, for me, I try to get brushes that are high quality. Since I do a lot of painting, I want to make sure that my brushes last. And then for my smaller brushes, I like to look for brushes that have what is called bounce back. And then for my big brush, I like one that is really nice and soft, that's going to cover a lot of area, that holds plenty of water. So just to kind of give you an idea of what all these things mean, let me show you here. So let's start with the Hake brush. Hake, H-A-K-E. So when I put water on this right here, you can see how much water, can you hear that? How much water that actually holds, right? But it has no bounce back. So like if I move this here, it stays there. So this is not something that I would actually use to paint with, but when I'm trying to wet a really large area, especially when I'm stretching paper, this works really well. Also, if I'm working on a bigger project and I need to do like a soft blend in, say, a sky or something, this could work for something like that. Okay. This is the 1/2" one, and this one is made out of sable. It's a sable brush, and you can see that it holds plenty of water, but it also has bounce back. So like when I'm painting with it and I press on it and I release it, it comes back. Okay, so that's really handy when you're trying to get into certain areas and you want to have a little bit of control over your brush. Same thing with the number 2. So you can actually see where you can shape that by spinning it, and then when you work with it, it has really nice bounce back. Where this number 1 is made out of different material, I'm not sure what, but it holds plenty of water just like the other ones, right? So if I'm wetting like an intermittent size area, a medium size area, then I can switch to this instead of the Hake brush, but it has no bounce back. It just kind of stays. If you are using synthetic brushes, just look for the same thing. Okay. Now synthetic brushes, in my opinion, they don't hold as much water as the natural brushes, and they don't last as long. As you can see here already, you can see some of the filaments kind of like sticking out, and they don't bounce back. So, they don't cost as much, but you don't get the quality of the natural brushes. The next thing on our list is called Liquid Frisket, and you can buy any brand you want to. And basically what the Liquid Frisket does is you put it down and you let it dry to protect the paper, right? So we don't really use white paint when we work with watercolors, right? So if you plan ahead and you mask off the areas that you want to keep white, the Liquid Frisket comes in handy. If you have a really large area that you have to mask off, you can also use tape, and I'll show you those later on. Now, the big thing about Liquid Frisket, number 1, this will ruin your brushes. So never use your quality brushes to put this on, okay? And all it is basically like a liquid latex. So you give it a good shake, and you put it on the area that you want to protect, and then clean your brush like right away, because if you forget, you might as well just throw the brush away. Okay. Now it dries relatively fast, and when it is completely dry, you can paint right over that. And then once the paint is dry, you can use this frisket remover to remove the frisket, and that area will stay white. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the painting sessions. And for your masking tape, I like to keep a couple of different sizes around. And this is 1.5 inches, and I actually use this whenever I'm securing the masking tape onto the backing board. It could be cardboard or masonite or something else. If you are, however, working on a bigger project, like a full sheet or a half sheet, then you're going to want to stretch your paper instead of taping it. And again, I'll show you that in one of our upcoming. But for most small projects, you can use masking tape to secure your paper onto a backing board. And the reason that you want to do that is when you start working on the watercolor paper, it's going to buckle up, right? And if you forget to tape it down before you get the paper wet, as the paper dries, those buckles are going to stay there. But if you tape it down really well before you start painting, as the painting dries, the paper will actually re-stretch itself to a degree. So it's never going to get perfectly flat, but it's going to be a lot better than if you forget to tape it down. Alright, for the water containers, you can use pretty much anything that you have available to clean out your brushes. So the one that I like to use, this one here, has a place for you to hold your brushes, different size brushes, and more importantly, it has those ridges on the bottom there so that when you're cleaning your brush, you can gently rub them against that, and that'll help get the paint out of the bristles. So I've been using this for years, so it's pretty dirty, and I use it not only for my watercolor paints but also when I work with acrylics. But you can use whatever you have available. I also use a small container that I keep with clean water, because often when you're painting with watercolors, you have to wet certain surfaces or certain areas with clean water before applying colors for mixing. So I try not to use this water when it gets all dirty, so I always keep one of these handy. And then if I am, doing a plein air painting, I always have like a little jug to keep some extra water in. And that's pretty much it as far as that goes. And of course you need paper towels. Now, for obviously the most important thing in watercolors is the paint itself. You want to make sure that you get some nice quality paints. The better the quality, the longer they last. I'll talk a little bit about the differences. So you can get something like this, right? If you're just trying it out, you're not sure whether or not you want to invest in it, you can start off by buying something cheap like this and just playing with it and see if you like working with the watercolors. But if you want to get more serious about your watercolors, then you want to switch over and get the higher end. But you don't need to buy like a ton of colors to get started. So I'm going to kind of go over the ones that I use so that and tell you why I use them, and then hopefully that will help you when it's time for you to purchase your own. Okay, so the first color that I use is a cadmium yellow, and it doesn't matter what brand you use, just try to get the high end. And these colors are light fast, they're very strong, they're concentrated, the quality of the pigment is really good, the quality of the medium is really good, so they last you a long time, and they mix really well with the other colors. This will work really well when you're mixing your greens and your oranges. So cadmium yellow. The next one is cadmium red, or cadmium red light, depending on what brand you buy. But the cadmium red is a warm red. It almost looks orange already, but this works really well when you are trying to mix orange. In a perfect world, yellow and red will always make orange, but in the chemical world, we have to get the right kind of yellows, the right kind of reds, the right kind of blues, etc. Alizarin crimson is a darker red, so I like to use this when I make my violets, right? If I try to use the cadmium red and mix it with blue to make a violet, it makes a kind of a dirty violet. So to make my purple, I actually use the crimson, and then I use the ultramarine blue. And just like before, it kind of gets a little weird. The ultramarine blue works really great with the crimson to make a purple, but it does not work that great with the yellow to make a green. So when you want to make a green, you want to use the phthalo blue. Phthalo blue and yellow will give you some absolutely beautiful greens. And then for brown, sometimes I mix my own brown, but sometimes I just buy them, and I like to use the burnt sienna, which is a warmer brown, but you can also use the burnt umber. And that's it, really. You can get additional colors, especially if you have a certain style where you use like a favorite color all the time, but this will get you going. This is more than enough to be able to do some nice quality watercolor paintings. I try not to use black when I'm watercolor painting. If I need pure black, I tend to use ink because the ink doesn't smear once it dries where the black watercolor does. And white doesn't really work well with watercolors. You never get a really nice clean white. And I don't like to introduce acrylic paints. So instead of using the white paint to try to recover an area, I usually try to plan ahead and save it with the frisket first. Okay. All right, and then the last thing is somewhere to store all this stuff. I like to use a traditional tackle box just because it's convenient. It holds all of my paints. The brushes I don't put in here. I like to keep the brushes separate to protect them. But you can see it fits the tape just fine. Some miscellaneous stuff that you're going to need for some of the techniques. Salt is one of the things that we use. Dishwashing liquid. I use that to protect the brushes when I'm working with the frisket. I have some pencils, I have some erasers, and so forth and so on. This is just a really nice, convenient way to hold everything. I also have one for my acrylic paints. I have a different one for my oil paints. It's great for on the go. So like if you're doing plein air painting, you grab your tackle box that has all your stuff in it. You grab your water containers and your paper, and you go and do your thing. It also works great in the studio. When I'm working in the studio, I have this on a shelf. Get everything ready that I need, put it back on the shelf, makes cleanup super easy, and I don't lose things. So I would recommend, and you don't have to buy a fancy art box. Just a regular old fishing box that's half the price works just as well. So those are my recommendations. So those are the things that we're going to be using over the course of this series. On our next video, we're going to be looking at creating a color wheel with watercolors, as well as doing some traditional swatches, so that you can see the different techniques used when painting in watercolors. All right, so those are all the things that you'll need to join us in this upcoming series. So I hope that you stick around for the next one, where we'll take on the color wheels and color swatches. And then after that, we'll begin doing some simple paintings to kind of get you used to working with watercolors.